Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'll do a short little intro that'll give folks a couple more minutes to log in before we get started with today's presentation. My name is Tom Reed. I'm the program manager for the Energy and Manufacturing in Appalachia program. And so I'm just going to speak for just a couple minutes in case you aren't familiar with EMA. First and foremost, I would encourage you to go to the email address or the website address at the bottom, wemakeithere.org/energy. We have a lot of great content, upcoming events, energy reports like the solar report that we're going to hear about today. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and send out a direct link to our solar information, and there you can download the solar report. I encourage you to do that now if you're able to. If not, copy this link and you can go to it right after today's presentation. I think you're going to find it informational and useful. This is our now 12th energy report on supply chains, and it's focused on a manufacturer, what information they would need to make a go, no-go decision on entering or expanding their efforts in that supply chain. So I think those useful. You can see here over to the side, we have several on natural gas, nuclear. We have 4 just on AI data centers. So there's a lot of great information out there. I encourage you to take a look. Our upcoming events that we have, January 8th, we have a rapid fire that's going to look at many of these supply chain segments and one short 30-minute time frame. Then we'll get back to a specific webinar that focuses on our next report, natural gas midstream supply chain. February, we have 2 more reports coming out, hydrogen and chemicals, and then March 5th is circular plastics. And then we have a couple more that'll probably be coming later in the spring, but we try to get about 2 per month out. So just want to encourage you again, take a look at that information. I'm now going to turn it over to Tom Bresniak. He is with the Penn State University Energy Extension. They have helped us with a couple of these energy supply chain reports, and this one on solar is really good because obviously within the 2 presidential administrations that we've had here, they have different perspectives and different focuses, but I think as you'll hear today, there's still a driving demand and focus on solar that isn't going to go away. Just maybe a slightly different approach. But with that, I will turn over to you. Oh, the last thing I do want to say is please put any of your questions or comments in the chat, and we will address those at the end. But with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Hey, thanks, Tom, for the intro. I appreciate that. Yeah, today we're going to go over, if you hadn't had a chance to download the document, I think they put the link in the chat, so go ahead and do that. We're kind of going to go over some of the highlights from that. I hope you find it pretty interesting. I think we enjoyed working on the program here. So we're going to really focus on opportunities, growth, and innovations for the solar industry. A little snapshot of the agenda, some of the things we're going to cover, looking at the bipartisan support of it, some big tech investment coming up, where we are on the map, where we're going. I do like this snapshot on the right that shows trends and pricing for photovoltaics and the panels. And we have seen this trend for some time. If you go back to 2011 compared to today, really a plummeting of the price of these panels. One interesting trend we're seeing here lately is that really the price of the panels for the utility commercial side, they're coming much closer together, and that might be a great opportunity to develop more solar in the commercial sector, because that had really lagged behind the large scale utility, but we're seeing that tighten up. So that would be something where you see like a Walmart Supercenter or Target or something getting solar panels. There might be more and more opportunities as that price gap kind of disappears. Kind of a really interesting trend there. So what's the overview of the industry today? It's definitely expanding. We just highlighted all those falling costs are a big part of that. That really comes from the technology improvements in the panels. So that keeps going on. And we're going to see rising electricity demand through 2030. If you've picked up any news in the last few months, you've probably seen some article on energy prices going up, especially electricity. I think this year we're probably looking at, on average, around a 13% increase in your residential bill. That's going to affect commercial bills as well. So there's a big growth in demand after decades of really stagnant electricity use in this country. There are a lot of drivers from AI data centers to the electrification of industry and transportation. So we're seeing those trends. And so if you look at the historical forecasting for installations, the chart on the right kind of shows some of the global forecast. China is really the biggest player in this, so they are producing a ton of panels. But you see really steady growth in North America as well on this chart. Pretty much every region around the globe is seeing more and more solar installations. These are predicted to go up quite a bit. They're about 655 gigawatt today. Looking into the 930 plus just by 2029. In the US, about 5 to 7% of electricity is coming from this, about 219 gigawatt in cumulative capacity. Um, some of the emerging tech, the perovskite panels are sort of newer. They really are helpful. They're able to get more of the light spectrum out there and turn it into energy, so it's a little bit more of an advanced panel system. And then when you hear about the bifacial panels, really it's able to not only get the incoming solar radiation that's hitting the panel, but what's bouncing off the ground back up. So that's why bifacial, it's two-sided panel, but that actually has quite a bit of an increase in the production for that solar facility. And we're going to see a lot more on hybrid systems with batteries. I think that's really a growing trend. And I think maybe they had another segment on just that. But batteries are a big trend, pairing them up with solar facilities. It is a bipartisan solar energy policy over the years. We have seen this. Um, they're looking for energy independence, obviously a job creator, and goals in emission reduction. The first Trump administration saw investment tax credit extensions. They did put a tariff on imports to kind of support the U.S. industry growing. So that was a trend under the first Trump administration. Then the Biden administration really opened things up with the Inflation Reduction Act, which was billions of dollars in credits, which still do exist. There is time before the end of the year to get quite a bit of the tax credits still. And even into next year, there are some opportunities remaining from that. A big push for manufacturing, and there was a Solar for All program during the Biden administration. The current Trump administration is rolling back those Inflation Reduction Act incentives. But in talking to the industry, honestly, it's matured to the point where a lot of those incentives are really a big bonus for them. It didn't make or break the projects. So even those are beginning to roll back. It's kind of a great time to still be involved in solar because the industry has matured. And then there's a shared focus from both administrations on the utility scale side for grid resilience and some of the net zero goals. Big tech. Big tech has been an investor in solar for some time. A lot of this is being pushed from the AI data center side of things to meet some of their internal stakeholders' clean energy needs. So you still see a lot of the push from the big players in here. Amazon putting in 20 billion for green expansions, 5 gigawatt of that in renewables. Google's looking at solar and wind for 24/7 carbon. There's a big push at Microsoft to have 10 gigawatts by 2030. And Meta and the others have about 84 gigawatts in commitments. So solar is going to play a big part in their drive for these net zero pledges. And they're looking at power purchase agreements to kind of reduce some of the risks for their developers. And a lot of that would be from their investment in solar. So, we can look at data center demand possibly doubling by just 2030, which would really spur this solar plus storage innovation that I think you're going to see more of. And we're going to talk about some of that a little bit later as well. So looking at the market size, what's the installed capacity here? U.S. market size around 33 billion in 2025. You have a compound annual growth rate of about 23% between 2015 and 2025. And you're looking like 34% year-on-year growth. So definitely still some major growth in this capacity coming online. Looking at 219 gigawatt generating about 300 billion kilowatt hours annually. So quite a bit of energy coming from that. You see on the left there a chart looking at those installation forecasts, which continue to rise well through 2030 there. Some of the milestones, about 40 gigawatts added in 2024. A very large, interesting project in Nevada called Gemini Solar came online, an enormous facility there with a lot of battery capacity. A very unique way they did this, a trend in the industry. Really, instead of using inverters, those panels which are producing direct current are just using that direct current to charge the batteries. In a lot of installations, you have an inverter so that the grid could use AC power to actually back up the batteries and power the batteries. So these really big utility scale projects like the Gemini Solar are doing this a little bit differently. It actually lowers the cost to do it that way. But I thought that was an interesting trend. And if you haven't heard about that project, you might want to Google that one. It's pretty neat to look at. Some of the competition would be from wind and gas, but they're all being supported by incentives still. But solar has a pretty strong future well out through the projections for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So what are those growth forecasts beyond 2030? You have the U.S. looking at 412 gigawatts by 2030, and then an annual growth is even going to be greater there. So by 2050, the U.S. could have 1,600 gigawatts, 40 to 45% of electricity could be powering from solar, and globally, you're looking at terawatts of power production by 2050. So this keeps ramping up. The chart on the right shows a bunch of states, including Pennsylvania, and kind of where they have looked at in their installed solar capacity between 2012 and 2024. And you can see really kind of a rocket ship launch there, probably around 2019 or so. And that trend, while it may level off a tiny bit, I think that the technology's there and the industry has matured. You're going to see continued growth in that. But a number of those states really had some astronomical growth in solar. In the equipment market, you're looking at a compound annual growth rate around 9%. So great drivers there. Inflation Reduction Act was a big driver. Looking at low carbon power purchase agreements drove this, but there will be some challenges from the rollbacks and the incentives, and some of the grid interconnection issues have been big, and you've probably heard a lot about that in the news as well, but that still remains a bit of a challenge for the industry. So when we look at the market segments here, we'll just touch on the different segments. Obviously, you have residential on the smaller 5 to 10 kilowatt rooftops. There was a tax credit there of 30% that still is available right now. That will be rolled back in the next year. You still have commercial and industrial, which we looked at on the first slide. Some of these costs have really come in line between these commercial facilities, like that picture of the Target there, and the utility scale. The panel costs are closing a gap that we haven't seen before. So it'll be interesting to see maybe more of a commercial industrial window for growth to put these panels on existing buildings or to ramp that up. There still were some incentives that are going to roll back on that. And then utility scale, we don't see this really going down at all. There are tons of interconnection agreements trying to get through right now. And you're looking at, these are greater than 2 megawatt installations, but quite a bit of growth anticipated there through 2030. The versatility here, these are distributed quicker, and you have the utility scale, which of course is a scalable thing. You could keep adding on to that. Some challenges there maybe in getting some property agreements, but you're going to see continued growth in all these segments in the years to come. So what are some of the key drivers that we're looking at? You have rising clean energy demand. The data centers are looking for them, electrification of a number of industries. I've seen some interesting things on the data centers because if they can get the backup to be more of a battery backup, they're interested in solar. Some of these really large hyperscale projects, they encompass thousands of acres as a buffer to these centers, and they usually have large transmission lines coming into the facility, which is the perfect recipe for putting up solar. And so if they could just leverage that right on site, potentially put in some batteries to leverage if there are any kind of blips in whatever power they're using as the primary source. I think it's an interesting idea, and I think you're going to see that on more and more of these large energy campuses. You still have federal policies, like I said, Inflation Reduction Act's rolling back, but there still are incentives there. We talked about the tech advancements with the bifacial and perovskites. You're looking at a driver for energy security all the time and grid reliability. You see some communities doing this, especially if they were subject to weather like a hurricane or something, putting in solar to back up small communities so that they don't have to be out of power for maybe weeks or months in a disaster like that. Decarbonization of the industries has kind of fueled some of this as well. And then you have workforce and supply chain development and public-private collaborations. So a lot of things are still driving this market for the next few decades to come. So what are the challenges and concerns that we see here? There have been some higher costs and some delays. You're looking at about $1,000 a kilowatt on the utility side has been a challenge. Uh, Public safety misconceptions. We do a lot of general education on that, and Michigan State actually did a really in-depth study on what the public doesn't like about solar or doesn't understand. Issues like toxicity and fires are really, really not prevalent at all, but in the public eye, there's always room for more education on this. So that's always a challenging concern. End of life, the waste and recycling of the panels has been a concern. You're looking at leases on the utility side, often 25, 35, even 50-year leases. So at the end of that life, where do those panels go? What are the agreements for recycling that? We have not many large centers in the U.S. can take a utility scale recycling program. There are a few, but there are some concerns on end of life for that, and aging panels and degradation of the panels. The picture on the left is something of a phenomenon that has happened a bit in Texas. Hailstorms, like major hailstorms, can do some damage on the older panel designs. So if they're tracking panels, they can usually be locked in place and really avoid some of that damage. But maybe some of the earlier utility scale sites were susceptible to that kind of damage. You do have competition from gas and other renewables as well in this sector. And then you have some regulatory and financial hurdles for the advanced tech. Maybe a lot of the investment was coming from maybe some larger banks when they saw the tax credits were there at a pretty high rate. You may see some of that coming back to a lower level. And then supply chain dependencies. These panels are predominantly produced in China, and there has been some pushback on, can we ever get enough in this country produced, and does it make financial sense to do that? But that supply chain can be a little rough at points because of some of those things. This is in your packet as well. Just a real quick overview of what a basic panel, the components are, and maybe you're supplying parts or all of this to folks. But you have the solar cell itself, the core photovoltaic, and then there's a glass cover and a back sheet to this. So a frame, a junction box inverter. These are all those basic parts. They're not super, super complicated to do this, but again, only a few places really dominate, and China really is producing the world's uh, biggest chunk of solar panels. So what are some of the traditional and advanced manufacturers? I just listed a few here from some of these more traditional that you may have heard of or looking to work with. But as you get into some of the more advanced panels, like the perovskite or the bifacial, there's some other manufacturers that are kind of going into that marketplace. But lots of potential out there and lots of manufacturers to work with. We try to cover that and list some for you in the packet. And then, if you're looking to kind of join up with some trade associations, a lot of choices here, both in North America and some international ones as well. And then don't forget, the Department of Energy has a solar office and NREL here. They do a lot of work as a resource for you and to reach out to some of these trade associations that you might want to be interested in working with. So a map of where it is today. I kind of liked how this was set up to show you where there are planned facilities for 2025 on the utility scale side of this. And it is interesting. Two of the states that really kind of were in the forefront of development would be California and Texas. And you see a large mixture in both of those states of both solar and battery. So you're seeing more and more of that. California kind of was more of a stick approach to that, the regulatory pressure on requiring it, and Texas was more of the carrot side. So they incentivized this a lot. Texas is unique. They are isolated from the two major east and west interconnected electric grids. If you've heard the term ERCOT, that's the Texas grid. So Texas is uniquely isolated from the rest of the country. They are now working a bit because of some issues they had in recently not being able to produce power in cold weather to get a little more interconnection to some of the grids. But it's interesting to see where it's kind of focused. But you do see a lot coming into New York and PA as well. New York did a lot of incentives earlier for solar, so you saw a great bit of growth there. But a real nice snapshot of this, and I liked how they pointed out where the battery use is integrated in California, Texas, two big players in that. So in conclusion, to recap, solar's growth to 412 gigawatts by 2030, and it's going to be driven by tech, some of the policy, and some of the demand, despite the challenges we talked about. So it looks like a pretty bright future for solar, and if you're in that arena to work in the manufacturing, I think there's a lot of opportunity there that we talked about. So I'll stop sharing my screen here, and I'll see. I don't know if we had any questions come in or.
Yeah, hey Tom, we did, so appreciate that. Great information as always. So we did have a few questions, and this one says it talks about since our rural areas do not have large population, is it feasible to develop commercial scale solar farms? And as a follow up or secondary on that, how will solar power affect the cost of electricity?
Yeah, that's all. It's always an interesting, thing to think about because you need a lot of room for utility scale. You need acreage to do that. But oftentimes, the more rural parts, especially in Pennsylvania, they may not have the electric infrastructure. So when you're driving around, you see the large transmission lines along the road. What you may not realize when you look out the window is if you were to build new transmission on those very large ones, you're probably today looking at somewhere between $5 and $6 million per mile. So that would be the biggest restriction is limited access to large transmission. Now, if you're in an area where you see transmission lines cut across your area, and Pennsylvania has a lot of transmission, we actually export 25% of the power that we produce. So we're an energy powerhouse here. We do have electrical infrastructure cutting through some of those areas, but not all. So I'd say look for that. If someone's knocking on your farm door, when we get calls, that's the first thing we ask, proximity to transmission lines. Are you getting three-phase power to that farm or area? If you say no to both of those, I'm going to say it's highly doubtful that you're going to see a large project come to fruition. Um, at the end of the day, there's a race for power. So the more power you can get into the system, the better it is for rates. I don't think it would have a direct effect. A large scale solar facility coming into your rural area probably won't maybe directly affect you unless you own the land, and then it might be a nice, lucrative leasing agreement for you. But directly affecting that area, it's going to feed normally one of the larger investment-owned utilities, maybe First Energy, PPL. It'll go into that system, and they are doing that obviously because it's one of the absolute lowest costs of power they can get online, and when it's producing. It is intermittent though, so it's really good currently at shaving off those really hot days that are sunny. It's a great power source there. The trend to the battery systems with the photovoltaics that we talked about is really an opportunity to save that power up during the real sunny time of the day. And then when people come home in the evening, 6 or 8 o'clock at night, there's currently maybe a 4 hour, 6 hour battery you can do. So you can go ahead and deploy that energy that you already stored up and shave that peak off. So in that respect, yes, that would be helpful to the utility, and at the end of the day, keeping their rates low.
Well, you hit the other question and maybe just expand on or explain for peak shaving. Says, how does solar fit into peak shaving? But maybe for some people,
Yeah,
just
yeah,
explain it.
yeah. If you look at, I mean, maybe I should have put one in there. If you ever look at a chart of the day, obviously when people wake up, they're getting ready for work or whatever, they're using a lot of power. A coffee maker uses some power, you're getting all that going. So you have this peak in the morning and it starts to kind of to go down. And then industry's coming on in the day, there's more of a leveling. But you get into that center part of the day, everybody's doing something, and that's usually a time of the day when there's a lot of sun. So that's the time you can deploy that at the absolute lowest cost. So if you're triggering power purchase agreements, that can be one of the lowest cost agreements you could sign, if you're a utility to get it from there. This works really, really well out west because they do have a better solar radiation than we do. But there's opportunities to do that here as well and across the country. But it really shaves off that peak load hit to the utility because during that time, they're normally paying the absolute highest rate for power, and they don't want to do that. So here's an opportunity to kind of shave those peaks off, and that saves them, millions and millions of dollars, and is helpful to keep those rates low.
Good. So, last question here, and this is really just a specific supply chain question. You mentioned where China dominates the market, but we've seen the price coming down as well. Do you see, for domestic manufacturers, our core audience, specific areas of the supply chain where they can engage, or do you see that as kind of across the board opportunities?
I mean, there were some big incentives still for U.S. manufacturing. I think there will be opportunities to work with or become part of that. But I think from looking at a marketing, what market to kind of look into, I think that commercial market, if you see the cost coming down to do that, that's very interesting because when we do public talks, people say, "Oh, why don't you just put them on buildings?" Really, the cost was prohibitive for a number of years, but that's coming down. So that might be a big opportunity going forward if you're a supplier or manufacturer to kind of get into that space.
Okay. Well, good. You covered them all. We appreciate that. And I turn it back over to Tom Reed there if he's any questions to close out.
Yeah, I would just thank everyone for attending today, and thank you, Tom, for sharing this information. I think it's a constantly new information, new technologies, and I think you pointing out how the costs are coming down. So I think that adds a new wrinkle, a new interest for companies who maybe looked at this a few years ago and didn't know if it was a good fit. There might be an opportunity now. So yeah, thank you for sharing that information. And again, if you haven't downloaded the report, I encourage you to follow that link and take a look at it yourself. If there's an energy supply chain you'd like to know more about that you don't see a report for, let us know. We can maybe add it to our list.